I'm Dr. Tony Peloso, a strategist and innovator in the public sector and entrepreneurial space at the Graduate School of Business at QUT. Recently, I caught up with a noted expert in creating innovation in the public space. Dr. Annette Quayle is a lecturer and researcher at QUT in the School of Accountancy. She's a noted specialist in the field of auditing and accountability, primarily in the government sector. And its current research includes improving governance, integrity and financial accountability in local government, and promoting transparency in government spending decisions and public-private finances. Welcome, Annette.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here. Thank you. Now, Annette, you recently shared at a public policy forum that good policy needs to be focused on the future. You made the statement that, despite claims to the contrary, the problems of government and policy are the same over the long term. So we need to find new ways to address them. Can you tell me more about your statement and your thinking behind it?
At the time, I didn't realise that it was actually sort of notable or controversial that I had said that. I think that if you've been around longer than sort of 5 years in the policy space, or even if you just listen to the news, then there's things that you see that are happening today that actually were the same things happening 5, 10, 20 years ago, sometimes 30 years ago. So I think a kind of historical perspective is really helpful there. And when I think about that, I'm thinking about, examples like fraud and corruption in local government, which is sort of one of my areas that I'm really interested in. That's not something that's new, that's something that's actually been happening all of the time for the last sort of 20 years, probably 30 years since we've had local government. If we think about intergenerational disadvantage, that's an issue that we've had that is exactly the same sort of as that, or as an issue 20, 30 years ago. So I don't think the problems are significantly different when we go down to the heart of them. I think how we think about them now is going to be, we have to think about them in different ways.
So Annette, I think you're suggesting that it's not only necessary to break the cycle, but we need to find new ways to create the strategy and the thinking behind the strategy process.
I think ideas, in government, in policy, ideas are really the currency. So trying to find new ways of looking at these problems is actually going to be at the heart of what makes, I think, our future nation, the way that we do our jobs, the way that we help people who, are in situations where they need interventions from government. I think, that new way of thinking about it, and that's actually more of a strategic process of thinking rather than just reacting, I guess, to the day-to-day issues that are emerging.
Annette, you've also said that good policymakers are focused on the future. Tell me more about this.
Yeah, I guess, as an academic, and I'm always interested in sort of finances, and we always have conversations around budgets in particular. And one of the things that is really key is knowing that no one can project what a budget is ever going to look like. And I guess when I think about that and apply it to sort of different sort of ways of thinking in the future, it's exactly the same issue. We don't know what the future is going to be like, but part of what makes policy making interesting and exciting is the opportunity to start to really reach out and think about what that future could look like. And budgeting's a little bit like that process, where we're saying we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but we need to start making plans and projections about how we think that could play out. And I think if we think about doing that planning process and imagining what that future is going to be like, then a lot of opportunities then for us to fill in, ways of dealing with that, ways of responding to different scenarios can play out. And that's, scenario thinking, I think, could be really helpful here.
So Annette, you raise a really important point, and I love that you say scenario thinking. I always get concerned when people talk about scenario planning and plausibility, because I think that really restricts us about what we're doing. So tell us more about your thinking about scenario thinking.
In business schools, we always like scenarios, and scenarios are really helpful for looking at sort of possibilities, and then, what plans can we put in place to then respond to some of those sort of possibilities. The problem with scenarios, of course, is that it's really confined to us being able to decide what are those possibilities. So the next question has to be, how do we capture things that we can't actually yet imagine? Ways that the world could be like. And to do that, I think we really need to get different people around the table. So if we just get the same people around the table, I think we're only going to come out with the same ways of, capturing problems that we probably, already know about. And so while that's helpful to one level, I think, for planning, I think really good blue sky thinking needs very different people around the table. And I think that's kind of what the UK is starting to think about, in that kind of what seems to be, radical idea that that Dominic Cummins is mentioning about, let's get really different people around the table and see what happens. So ways that we can structure that might be, a good way to sort of find new ideas and new ways of thinking about what the future could be like, which is what scenario planning is all about.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, Annette, finally, what message do you have for policymakers and those who need to get on and actually deliver on policy?
I think we're only ever impressed by how hard policymakers are working. And I, really think our currency has to be ideas when it comes to policy making. That, we talked a little bit at the beginning about the fact that these aren't new problems, but we need new ways of really looking at these problems. And if we're going to have new ways of looking at them, then I think that really involves us finding new ideas. So for policymakers, my advice has to be, what are the options and ways that you can go about finding new ideas and new ways of looking at your problems. I'm an academic, so I'm going to say that, talking to academics is definitely one of those places that you can go for new ideas, but academics don't have all the answers, obviously. So I think really trying to find ways of sort of stepping outside the institution of government and reaching out into a broader community, public, private, not-for-profit, academics. That's the kind of space, I think, where we need to be getting better ways of sort of looking and thinking about our problems and finding, hopefully, better solutions.
One of the things that fascinates me is this concept of ambidexterity, and built around the notion that part of an organisation needs to be focusing on doing what we currently do better. I think we call that the exploit part of the ambidextrous model. And then there's that exciting piece, the explore part. It doesn't necessarily take a lot of time, doesn't really need a lot of focus, but that true creation. So it sounds very much to me like we need to get on with it and do it. So the business as usual, in a sense, but we also need to be literally thinking really quite differently. And I think I'm really excited about your ideas around finding those new ways of thinking and having different and new people in it.
I think the only caveat I would place on that, and that's as someone who's gone and spent some time working with policymakers on a day-by-day basis, and it's the time issue. And I think, when you're really time poor and you're just trying to put out fires and you're trying to deliver, in a policy-making space, which is oftentimes very stressful and sort of an immediate kind of decision-making process, then finding time to have that kind of deeper way of looking and thinking and engaging with issues is really important. And I think, not that I know any Director Generals, but if I had advice, it is, how can we build that into our day-to-day working so that we can actually start to think about and have time to reflect on different ways of doing it, thinking about different ways that we can actually look at the problems that we're trying to kind of put out all of the time, all the fires we're trying to put out. Can we have space to think about that in a sort of more reflective way? I think we can't, our brains just can't cope with all of the information overload that we have, and that's actually just too much to say, yes, it's good in theory, but how do we actually then make that reflective process work in practice? I think that's really the challenge for policymakers.
We've been working at the graduate school on something that we're calling a strategy journey map. So it's an icon-based approach to overall organisational strategy making. And one of the things that really appeals to me is that because of the way it's set up, the actual stakeholders in each of the pieces of the actual overall strategy creation, implementation place have a say. So I kind of think of it more as, rather than strategy coming from the top, it's strategy coming from within. And maybe that might sort of lighten the cognitive and time load that tends to happen. And I understand what you mean about senior policymakers and strategists.
I think delivery always happens at the bottom. I'm very much, as a researcher, interested in this sort of top-down versus bottom-up approach to problem solving in organisations. And, we all know in our day-to-day lives that, transport should ask us a bit more, because we're the ones using transport. So, we're the ones as the users that have a really invested interest in understanding what's going on and giving feedback as to that. How do we, give feedback into that process? So I think strategy has to be definitely something that's coming from the bottom, that's not just coming from the top. Because if we just leave it to those at the top of an organisation, as big as their picture is, delivering better outcomes for people is really something that's done, further down an organisation. So capturing that information and finding processes that we can capture that information is key.
And it sounds to me, we talk about customer centricity, but it almost sounds like we've invented something new. Let's call it sort of strategy maker centricity.
I love it.
So, Annette, thank you so very much for your time today. I know how passionate you are about this, and it really has been a pleasure chatting with you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Tony, for having me.